Deputy Mark Dalton thought it was just another quiet winter shift in Silver Creek, until the station doors burst open. Standing there was a little girl in a red coat, shivering, her eyes wide with fear. Beside her, a wounded German shepherd, mud and blood clinging to his fur. They weren't seeking shelter, they were begging for help. Following their desperate lead, Mark drove into the frozen wilderness. And what he uncovered on that mountain road would shake the entire town, bring tears to your eyes, and restore your faith in miracles. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Silver Creek was a town wrapped in winter silence. The streets lay buried beneath heavy snow, rooftops sagged under frozen weight, and the sky hung low, pressing gray clouds like a lid over the valley. The only sound was the wind, sharp and relentless, weaving through pines and rattling the shutters of old brick buildings. The police station stood at the corner of Maple and Fifth, a square brick building that served as both guardian and anchor for the town. Inside, the warmth of space heaters pushed against the cold, seeping through every crack. It smelled faintly of wool coats, burnt coffee, and paper that had been turned too many times. At his desk near the frosted window sat Deputy Mark Dalton, 38 years old, tall and broad-shouldered. His hair was dark brown, already streaked with gray at the temples. His face carried tired stubble, and his storm-gray eyes watched everything with quiet patience. Years ago, Mark had been a canine handler in the city. He had lost his canine partner to age and illness, and though he had returned to small-town policing, part of him still lived with the instincts of those days. He was steady under pressure, known for speaking softly but noticing what others missed. In the lobby, Officer Jim Parker, 26, wrestled with paperwork. Young, broad-chested, and fresh-faced, Jim carried an eagerness that made him both likable and clumsy. His light brown hair stuck up in a stubborn cowlick, and his habit of joking at the wrong time was something everyone tolerated with half smiles. By the coffee counter stood Captain Ray Harrington, the 55-year-old commanding officer. A tall man with a broad build and a salt-and-pepper beard, Ray had eyes like cold steel, sharpened by decades of service. He was respected because he never wasted words and never gave false comfort. Duty and loss had carved him into a man who carried authority like a second skin. The station was quiet, the radios humming low, the room drifting toward forgettable routine. Then the heavy double doors slammed open. A blast of wind and snow surged inside, making Jim nearly drop his papers. Ray looked up sharply, his entire body stiffening. Standing in the doorway were two figures, a young girl and a German shepherd. The girl was about 10 years old, with chestnut-brown curls spilling from beneath the hood of her red wool coat. Her cheeks were flushed pink from cold, freckles dusting her pale skin. Her hazel eyes shone with both fear and determination, and her small hands trembled as they clutched a leash. The coat was patched in places, old but warm, its hood framing a face that seemed far too young to carry such urgency. Beside her stood a large German shepherd, around 6 years old, with a sable and black coat dulled by mud and flecked with snow. A shallow wound marked one of his legs, dried blood darkening the fur. His amber eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the room. He stood tall, ears pricked, body tense, trained, disciplined. Ado Mampuns, working dog who had once known commands and purpose. He pressed himself close to the girl, as if shielding her. The lobby froze. Jim started to rise, uncertain. Ray's jaw set, reading the scene in an instant. Mark moved first, pushing his chair back and standing slowly, his hands visible. His voice dropped into the calm register he once used for nervous K9s. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Take your time." The girl's lips trembled. She could barely form words through the cold. Her eyes brimmed with tears but did not fall. Instead, she lifted her chin and pointed toward the dog as if letting him speak for her. The shepherd barked once, sharp and deliberate. Then he tugged at Mark's coat sleeve with surprising force before glancing back at the door. Mark crouched low, meeting the girl's wide, hazel eyes. "My name's Mark," he said. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, curls bouncing. Finally, a whisper escaped. "No, but we need help. Please." Her voice was small, but carried the weight of truth. Mark looked at the wound on the dog's leg, then back at the clipboard half finished on his desk. Whatever had brought these two here, it was no accident. He straightened, nodding once. "You found us." "That was the hard part," he told her. Then, glancing at the captain, "We need to move. Now." And in that moment, the quiet morning was gone. The storm outside was no longer just weather. It was the beginning of something that would test every instinct Mark still carried, and every ounce of faith the girl and her dog had left. The air outside clawed at skin and fabric alike, a feral cold that stung the lungs and scoured the cheeks raw. The storm had not reached its peak, but the sky carried that gray density that promised worse. Snow lay deep along the road edges, the plows still hours behind, and the sound of boots breaking crust echoed like muffled drumbeats in the hush. The town receded quickly behind them, its few glowing windows shrinking into amber specks, and the wilderness asserted itself with every step. Mark Dalton moved with a seasoned steadiness, his stride deliberate, his hand occasionally adjusting the collar of his thick coat. His eyes, a stormy gray under furrowed brows, scanned the whiteness for pattern. He had spent years following canine signals in alleys, fields, even ruins after storms, and though the city was far behind him, the instincts had never unthreaded from his mind. His breath streamed pale clouds, and his jaw set tighter with each gust of icy wind. Beside him, Lucy Hart clutched the leash with both mittened hands, her red coat stark against the pallor of snow and sky. Her small frame trembled with a mix of chill and fear, but there was a stubborn angle to her chin that belonged to someone much older. Her hazel eyes, wide and wet, shifted constantly from Bear to Mark, as though balancing trust between them. She did not chatter like children often do. Her silence was a language of urgency, only occasionally broken by a whispered plea, "Please, please save them," words that disappeared into the breath of the wind. Bear, the German shepherd, worked ahead in a taut half-circle. His sable coat bristled with frost along the guard hairs, and the shallow scrape on his foreleg had dried stiff with blood, but his gait was deliberate, controlled. He lowered his nose to the snow, weaving in and out of invisible scent trails, sometimes pausing to test the wind, sometimes letting out a sharp bark that seemed to puncture the silence. More than once he darted back to Mark, tugging lightly at his sleeve or nudging his hand before bounding forward again. To Mark, it was language, impatience, confirmation, direction. They followed. The path out of Silver Creek bent into the first shadows of the pine woods. Trunks stood tall and stripped by the wind, their needles sighing with snow weight, and the world smelled of resin and cold metal. It was there Bear stopped abruptly, paws braced, ears canted forward like radar. Mark crouched low, eyes narrowing to the ground. The snow was scuffed here, churned into shallow depressions that spoke of heavy wheels fighting through the drifts. A dark smear ran alongside. At first, Mark thought it was shadow, but his gloved fingers came away tacky and red. Blood. Not animal blood in the casual sense of a hunter's trail, but thick, human or canine, spilled in panic. Lucy's breath caught as she stared, her mitten lifted to cover her mouth. Mark steadied his voice, quiet and grounding. "You did right coming to me," he said. "This means we're close." A few yards farther, Bear pressed his muzzle to the snow again, growling low. His claws dug, uncovering darker patches beneath, a mixture of oil and crimson. The distinctive odor rose immediately. Gasoline, old metal, the scent of a truck wounded and leaking. Mark's eyes narrowed. "Vehicle went through here," he muttered. "Big one. Heavy axle." He remembered the dispatch chatter from weeks before, reports of vans moving through mountain roads at odd hours. No plates, never staying long enough to be checked. Too vague to act on then, too precise to ignore now. Lucy tugged at his sleeve, pointing with a trembling hand deeper into the pines. "This way." Bear says this way. Mark did not correct her. Children gave dogs voices when they needed them most. He only nodded, rose, and motioned her to stay close. They pressed onward, the snow crunching underfoot, breath steaming. Branches creaked overhead, the forest shifting with the weight of winter. Somewhere in the distance, a crow broke into flight, black wings against gray. Bear pushed forward with renewed urgency, shoulders low, tail stiff. Mark's mind catalogued the details. The trail narrowing, the pitch of the land beginning to slope, the increasing thickness of oil drops mixed with spatters of blood. This was no random accident. Something had come through here fast, too fast, and left its wounds behind. Lucy stumbled once, her small boots sinking into a drift up to her knees. Mark caught her by the elbow, lifting her lightly back onto the crust. "Easy," he said, voice still calm, though he felt the cold bite harder in his own legs. "We'll go slow until we need to go fast. Remember?" She nodded, her lashes clumped with frozen tears, and tightened her hold on Bear's leash. The shepherd glanced back, amber eyes flashing reassurance, then pressed forward again. At a break in the trees, the snow opened onto a clearing cut by tire tracks. They were wide, fresh enough that the edges had not yet collapsed with drift, and pointed up toward the mountain road. The smell of oil was stronger here, metallic and sour, mingled with something else, an acrid tang that burned the throat. Mark knelt, scooped a glove full of snow, and let it melt in his palm. The water ran pink. He looked to Lucy. "There was a truck," he confirmed, "and it wasn't empty." Lucy's lip trembled, but she lifted her chin. "We have to hurry," she said, the urgency snapping through her small voice. "They're waiting." "I heard them. Please." Bear punctuated the words with a sharp bark and lunged against the leash toward the incline, muscles coiling as if every second of hesitation was betrayal. Mark rose, his decision already set. He motioned Lucy forward, placed his broad hand lightly on her shoulder to steady her against the slope. Together, the three of them followed the line of blood and oil deeper into the mountain woods, toward whatever truth lay overturned ahead. The mountain road grew narrower the higher they climbed, snow pressing against the shoulders of the path like walls closing in. The forest fell away in jagged cuts, cliffs dropping into black shadows where the wind howled like a mourning horn. Mark Dalton trudged ahead with the practiced stride of a man who had walked too many crime scenes, his breath hissing in sharp plumes. Lucy Hart followed close, her red coat vivid against the white as if she were a flicker of fire in a dying world. Bear, the German shepherd, strained at the leash, his hackles up, tail stiff, every muscle shivering with urgency. They had been walking nearly an hour when Bear froze, his paws dug into the crust, nose lifted, ears locked forward. A low growl rattled in his throat, not of anger, but of grim recognition. Mark stepped beside him, scanning the slope below. The beam of his flashlight cut through the snow-thick air, finding the jagged outline of twisted metal far down in the ravine. The truck lay on its side like a broken toy, discarded by a careless giant, its wheels half buried in drift, its windows shattered into 1,000 icy diamonds. Steam, or perhaps smoke, rose faint from the crumpled hood. Lucy clutched Bear's fur and gasped, her eyes wide with tears glinting in the pale light. "They're here," she whispered, and the words trembled with both dread and hope. Mark crouched at the edge, calculating the descent. His hands, roughened by years of duty, gripped the ice-slicked trunk of a pine for balance. He studied the angles. Broken branches marking where the truck had careened down, gouges in the snow showing its violent tumble. It would be treacherous but possible. "Stay behind me," he ordered gently, glancing at Lucy, then added, "Keep hold of Bear. He knows how to move better than we do." Together they scrambled down, the slope biting at their boots, the snow grabbing with greedy hands. Bear moved with sure-footed determination, pausing to glance back, eyes urging them on. At the base, the sight struck harder. The truck's metal frame was bent grotesquely, doors twisted, glass scattered like frozen tears. The smell of oil and blood mingled with the metallic sting of winter. Mark lifted his flashlight, sweeping it over the wreck. At first he thought the cargo hold was empty. Then a sound sliced the silence, thin, desperate yelps, the kind that scrape against the heart. Lucy flinched, clutching Bear tighter, her lips parting as tears welled. "Do you hear them?" she pleaded, though the sound was undeniable. Mark moved to the back of the truck, boots crunching through snow mixed with shards of glass. The rear doors had buckled in the impact, but not fully torn open. He pried one edge, light cutting into the interior. What the beam revealed froze him mid-motion. Inside were rows of metal cages, stacked cruelly atop one another, each holding a body too thin, too weak, yet still alive. Dozens of German shepherds, ribs jutting, eyes luminous with terror, pressed against the bars. Some whimpered, some barked hoarsely, others only stared with the hollow gaze of creatures long abused. The cages smelled of rust, urine, and despair. Lucy's hands flew to her mouth, her breath hitching into a sob. She sank to her knees in the snow, Bear pressing close as if shielding her from the sight. Mark swallowed hard, his throat tight with the weight of it. He had seen many crimes, but something about animals suffering, silent victims with no voice, always pierced deeper. He remembered his old canine partner, the trust in those amber eyes, the devotion. Seeing these dogs betrayed by men broke something open in him. He pulled back from the door, chest heaving. He turned to Lucy, who looked up at him with wet, desperate eyes. "We have to help them," she said. Her voice was fragile but fierce, a child demanding justice from the world. Mark nodded slowly, steel forming in his gaze. "We will," he promised. He placed a gloved hand on Bear's shoulder. The dog pressed against the cages, whining low, tail stiff with agitation. The trapped dogs responded, ears perking, some scraping at the bars with renewed hope. The sound of claws on metal filled the air like a chorus of need. Mark tested the door again, straining against twisted hinges. It budged but held fast. He would need tools, backup, more hands. Yet he knew time mattered. The cold would kill as surely as cages. Above them, snow fell heavier, each flake hissing against the wreck. The forest pressed close, silent witnesses to the cruelty laid bare in the ravine. Mark exhaled, steadying himself. He had no answers yet, only the certainty that he could not turn away. The truth had arrived in cages, and now it was his burden to carry. And in that moment, With Lucy clutching Bear and the trapped dogs crying into the storm, he understood that whatever came next would not just test his training, but his soul. The wind howled down the ravine like a living beast, throwing needles of snow into their faces and clawing at their coats. Mark Dalton raised his radio, fingers stiff with cold inside his gloves, and pressed the call button. His voice, though strained by the gale, carried its steady weight. "Dispatch, this is Deputy Dalton. We have a major vehicle accident on the North Ridge, multiple victims. Alive. Request immediate rescue team and veterinary support. Repeat, this is urgent." The reply came broken by static, but he caught enough. "Copy, storm, response en route, hold position." He clipped the radio back, jaw clenched. Help would come, but in this weather, not fast enough. He turned back to the wreck. Lucy Hart crouched close to Bear, her red coat dusted white, her small hands gripping the leash with the determination of someone much older than 10. Her hazel eyes brimmed with fear but also fire. When she looked at the cages, her lips pressed tight, the childish roundness of her cheeks hardened by purpose. "We can't wait, can we?" she asked, her voice shivering more from urgency than cold. Mark shook his head. "No, kiddo. We start now." He reached for the crowbar strapped behind the truck's bumper, prying it loose from the wreckage. The metal was cold enough to burn, but it was the only tool they had. Bear whined and pressed against the first cage, his amber eyes flicking to Mark with desperate insistence. Mark jammed the crowbar into the twisted door latch, muscles straining, breath harsh. The hinge groaned, shrieked, then snapped, and the door flung outward. A German shepherd staggered out. Thin, mottled with scars, its ribs showing like the frame of a broken umbrella. It blinked at the sudden light, then pressed itself against Lucy, who whispered through chattering teeth, "It's okay. You're safe now." She stroked its matted fur with mittened hands, her voice trembling but tender. They moved cage by cage, Bear pawing and pushing, Mark prying open steel, Lucy reaching inside to coax frightened animals out. Each dog was a different story of suffering. One limped on a swollen leg, another's fur rubbed raw at the neck from chains, another no more than a pup, eyes too big for its gaunt face. The air filled with barks, whimpers, the scrape of claws against metal, a chorus of hope and desperation. The smell was sharp with ammonia and fear, but beneath it Mark felt something shift. The atmosphere no longer only despair, but a fragile edge of survival. The storm fought them with every heartbeat. Snow slammed sideways, plastering their hair, filling the cages again as fast as they cleared them. Lucy's cheeks were raw, her curls wet and clinging to her forehead. But she did not stop. She pressed her small fingers against cold locks, pushing, fumbling, learning quickly how to slide bolts when Mark's hands were too full. Each time a dog stumbled free, her face lit with tears and determination. Then Bear barked, sharply, ears pinned, and without warning bounded past them into the deeper snow of the ravine. "Bear!" Lucy cried, scrambling after, but Mark caught her shoulder. "Stay! Let him work!" Bear's instincts were keener than any flashlight, any human guess. The dog dug furiously into a drift at the base of a fallen log, snow spraying in frantic bursts. His growls turned to whines, and then a high-pitched yelp broke through. Mark hurried down, dropping to his knees. Bear had uncovered a small hollow beneath the snow, and from it came faint, muffled cries. He clawed deeper, teeth grabbing at packed ice, until at last a tiny shape tumbled free. A puppy, no more than a few weeks old, shivering violently, its fur crusted with ice. Bear nosed it gently, then dove back into the drift, refusing to stop. Within minutes, 2 more pups emerged, frail bodies barely moving. Lucy fell to her knees, wrapping the towel from earlier around the trio, her arms a trembling cradle. Her eyes glistened, voice breaking into sobs that were half joy, half grief. "They're so little. They were buried alive." Bear stood over her, panting, his chest heaving, eyes burning with fierce protectiveness. He licked Lucy's cheek once, then turned back to Mark as if to say the job wasn't finished yet. Mark pressed his hand firmly over Bear's head, gratitude flooding him. "Good boy," he whispered, the words almost lost in the storm. Then louder, to Lucy. "We'll keep them warm. They'll make it if we don't give up." They worked until their muscles screamed and their fingers bled against frozen metal. One by one, the cages opened, spilling battered lives into the snow. Some dogs circled restlessly, too weak to run. Others pressed close to Bear, tails flicking low in cautious trust. Lucy kept moving, though her lips were blue and her breaths shallow. At one point she wavered, nearly collapsing, but a rescued shepherd leaned against her leg, steadying her. She smiled faintly, whispered, "Thank you," then pushed herself back into motion. By the time the last cage groaned open, the ravine was alive with motion. Dozens of German shepherds staggering, circling, pressing close to one another and to the humans who had freed them. Their voices rose above the storm, a chorus not of fear, but of survival. Mark stood among them, chest heaving, sweat freezing on his brow, and for the first time that night, hope glowed against the snow. He glanced at Lucy, who was cradling the 3 pups close to her chest, her red coat flaring like a beacon in the swirling storm. Beside her, Bear stood tall, his head high, his fur bristled but proud. Mark knew they weren't finished. The storm still raged, danger still lurked. But in this moment, they had pulled life back from the edge of death. And that was enough to keep moving forward. The storm eased just enough for silence to slip between the trees, though the wind still tugged at coats and rattled the twisted frame of the truck. Mark Dalton pressed a palm against the door of the cab, its steel groaning beneath his weight. The windshield was a jagged lace of shattered glass, snow gathering in the cracks like salt on an old wound. He pulled himself inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting across the wreckage. The dashboard was bent, one dial stuck forever at 70. The driver's seat sagged sideways, stained with blood at the headrest. Whoever had driven had escaped or been taken. Mark's eyes fell on the glove compartment, half jammed shut. He pried it open, papers spilling like brittle leaves. Among them was a clipboard, the pages stiff with cold. Neat columns of numbers marched across it, broken only by crude initials and symbols. Triangles, circles, slashes, notations that meant nothing to him yet, but promised meaning to someone. Along the margin, words were written in shorthand, places abbreviated. WVR, MNT3, BLD12. He flipped further, his pulse quickening. The sheet wasn't about deliveries of lumber or produce. It was a manifest, a coded ledger for living cargo. Lucy Hart stood below in the snow, her small figure haloed by the glow of his flashlight. She cradled the 3 rescued pups inside her coat, their whimpers muffled against her chest. Her hazel eyes lifted to him when he emerged, clipboard in hand. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low, wary of the answer. Mark crouched beside her, showing the page. "This wasn't an accident, Lucy. This truck was part of something bigger. They're moving dogs, lots of them. Organized, coded locations, schedules. This is a network." Her lips trembled, and for a moment she looked every bit the 10-year-old she was. Then she bit them together, forcing herself steady. "My family's dog, Max. He disappeared months ago. He was trained, good, never ran away. I thought—" Her voice cracked, and she shook her head. "I thought maybe it was my fault for not watching the gate. But now—" She looked at the cages, at the half-frozen dogs blinking up at them. Now I think they took him. Just like these, Mark felt the words strike deep. He had worked with too many families who blamed themselves for cruelties committed by others. He studied Lucy, her freckled face flushed from cold and tears, her shoulders squared against grief. She was still a child, but she carried herself like someone who had already learned that the world could steal without warning. He placed a steady hand on her small shoulder. If Max was taken, this might lead us to him. To all of them, Bear nosed at the clipboard, whining as if agreeing. His fur bristled, ears twitching to every gust of wind, but his body pressed close to Lucy's side. He carried his own scars, mud, cuts, frost, but his eyes burned with the loyalty of a sentinel who would not abandon his post. Mark scanned the rest of the cab. The passenger seat was empty, except for a dented thermos and a pack of cigarettes, half crushed, the kind favored by truckers who never slept enough. A torn photo fluttered from beneath the seat. He pulled it out. It showed a man in his 40s, square-faced, unshaven, eyes shadowed with weariness, standing beside a long-haul truck. His build was solid but gone soft at the middle, his shoulders broad but his gaze evasive, the kind of man who had lived too long under orders or debts. On the back, scrawled in pen, was the name John Willis. Mark pocketed the photo. Whoever John Willis was, driver, smuggler, pawn, his face would matter later. For now, the ledger mattered most. Lucy leaned against Bear, silent but trembling with quiet fury. "Why would anyone do this?" she whispered. "They're just dogs." "They trust us." Mark's jaw hardened, silver flecks in his hair glinting in the flashlight. "Because people will always find ways to turn innocence into profit." "But they left us the map." He tapped the clipboard. "And that means they made a mistake." For a long moment, the only sound was the storm, dragging its feet across the treetops, and the soft whining of the freed dogs as they pressed against one another for warmth. Mark stood tall, his figure a dark silhouette against the snowy slope. In his chest, old instincts flared, the same that had once guided him and his canine partner through city raids, disasters, rescues, the same that told him when something wasn't random but calculated. This wasn't just about saving the dogs in this ravine. It was about stopping the hand that had chained them. He looked back at Lucy, her red coat bright even in the dim. She tightened her arms around the pups and nodded once, as though hearing his resolve without him needing to speak. Bear barked once, sharp and clear, and the freed shepherds raised their heads, tails flicking weakly in answer. The storm gathered again, swirling snow in heavy curtains, but Mark no longer felt the cold press so deeply. He had seen the truth inside the cab. And the truth was a trail. The storm relented by dawn, leaving Silver Creek buried beneath a white silence. The rescue teams arrived hours later, bundled in reflective jackets, their trucks grinding through drifts like metal beasts. Paramedics checked Lucy's frost-nipped hands and wrapped the pups in blankets, while animal control officers lifted weakened shepherds into crates lined with straw. Mark Dalton, weary but unbent, handed over the coded manifest he had found in the cab. He knew this was no longer a local accident. It was a map to something sprawling. 2 days later, after briefings that stretched past midnight, the town's quiet station was anything but sleepy. Officers from neighboring counties crowded the narrow halls, radios crackling, maps pinned against walls. At the center of the storm stood Agent Karen Whitfield, a federal investigator with the Department of Animal Trafficking Enforcement. She was in her early 40s, tall and sharp-featured, with steel-gray eyes that seemed always to look through, not at. Her black hair was cropped just below the jaw, streaked with silver that lent her an air of hard-earned authority. She had the lean build of someone who ran every morning, her suits cut with precision, her manner clipped. Karen's reputation was for being relentless, forged years earlier when she exposed a smuggling ring that had nearly slipped across 3 state lines. She carried herself like someone who had traded softness for certainty. Mark briefed her on the wreck in the ravine, Lucy's testimony, and the evidence he had collected. Karen listened without interruption, her jaw tightening at each detail. Finally, she tapped the manifest with a fingernail. These codes match chatter we've intercepted for months. Whoever's behind this has been moving animals along back roads, hidden under the cover of storms. They're bold, but they're sloppy enough to leave us a trail. Her voice was flat, but laced with conviction. We end it tonight. By evening, the operation was set. A warehouse on the outskirts of town, long abandoned by a logging company, had been flagged as a suspected holding site. The manifest listed it under initials BLD-12. Karen would lead the raid with her tactical unit, but she insisted on one unusual addition: Bear. Lucy stood in the station lobby when she heard, her red coat freshly laundered, cheeks no longer raw from frost, but eyes still carrying the shadows of the ravine. She clutched Bear's leash, unwilling to be parted from him. Karen knelt to meet the child's gaze, the hardness in her face softening a fraction. He's your dog now, but he's also more than that. He can help us find the truth. Will you trust us with him, just for tonight? Lucy hesitated, her hazel eyes darting to Mark. He gave her a steady nod, his voice calm. I'll be there with him, Lucy. He won't be alone. Neither will you. At last, Lucy released the leash into Mark's hands, though she stayed close, refusing to be sent away entirely. That night, under a bruised sky, the convoy rolled toward the warehouse. The building loomed against the snow, corrugated metal walls stained with rust, windows boarded, its outline more tomb than shelter. Floodlights snapped on as the unit deployed, shadows stretching long across the yard. Karen raised a gloved hand, signaling silence. The team advanced in 2 lines, rifles cradled, boots whispering over ice. Bear moved at Mark's side, tail low, ears sweeping like antennae. He sniffed along the warehouse perimeter, pausing near a stretch of concrete floor that seemed unremarkable. Then his body stiffened. He pawed once, twice, then barked sharply, nails scratching against a faint seam in the cement. Mark knelt, brushing away dust and snow. There it was, a hidden hatch, disguised beneath stacked crates. Karen's eyes narrowed. He's good, she muttered, then ordered her men forward. Crowbars pried, hinges shrieked, and the hatch gave way. A stairwell gaped below, the smell of urine and musk rising like a punch. The team descended, flashlights cutting through darkness. What they found stopped them cold. Rows of cages lined the underground room, more than the truck had ever held. Dozens of German shepherds, Dobermans, even rare breeds, their eyes catching the light in terrified flashes. Some barked hoarsely, others crouched silent, too broken to react. Ledger books lay on a desk at the far wall, filled with names, dates, payments, an entire empire of cruelty catalogued in neat handwriting. Karen exhaled through her teeth. This is it. This is the ring. Her voice was iron, but her hands curled tight at her sides. Mark moved through the rows, Bear pressing close, each dog they passed sparking a flicker of recognition in the shepherd's eyes. Lucy, though told to stay near the entrance, had crept close enough to see. Tears streamed down her freckled cheeks, but she stood straighter, her small frame braced by something larger than fear. Then movement shattered the stillness. From the shadows, men bolted. 2, then 3, faces masked, boots pounding across concrete. One carried a handgun, the other a knife. Karen barked orders, her voice sharp as a whip. The unit surged, lights and rifles trained. Bear lunged before anyone else moved, teeth flashing, forcing one man back against the wall. Mark disarmed another with a sharp twist, his jaw set like stone. Within moments, the smugglers were down, wrists cuffed, their curses drowned beneath the cries of the animals. Karen strode to the desk, flipping through the ledger with practiced speed. Names, contacts, drop points, enough to bring the whole network down, she declared, her gray eyes blazing. She turned to Mark, voice lower now. You and that dog just handed us the key. Bear barked once, standing tall amid the cages. The freed dogs pressed their noses to the bars, ears lifting at the sound, as if hope had returned in a single bark. Lucy slipped too. Marks sighed, wrapping her arms around Bear's neck. We did it, she whispered, and though her voice shook, it carried the certainty of truth. The warehouse echoed with the clatter of cages opening, the shuffle of men in chains, and the first tentative wags of tails. In that cold underground chamber, lit only by floodlights and faith, the cruelty of the ring was laid bare. And in the center of it all stood a little girl in red, her dog, and the man who had chosen to follow them into the storm. A month had passed since the warehouse raid, and Silver Creek had shed its cloak of winter severity. Snow still framed the rooftops and sat heavy on pine branches, but the town square was alive with color and sound. Lanterns glowed from every corner, strung high against the brick facades, and banners flapped in the breeze, proclaiming, "Honor our heroes." The air smelled of roasted chestnuts from street vendors and faint wood smoke from chimneys, blending into the comforting aroma of a community that had survived something larger than itself. Mark Dalton stood at the edge of the gathering, his tall frame wrapped in a dark wool coat. His once grim expression softened as he watched people filter into the square. Neighbors he'd known for years, their faces marked by pride rather than fatigue. His hair, streaked more heavily with silver than before, caught the lantern glow. The lines around his mouth spoke of long nights and heavier thoughts, but tonight his gray eyes carried something lighter, a quiet flame of hope. In the center of the crowd, Lucy Hart clutched Bear's leash, her red coat bright as ever. The fabric had been patched by her aunt's careful hands after the storm, but it only made the coat more beloved, more symbolic. Lucy's chestnut curls had been combed into neat waves, and her cheeks glowed with the warmth of excitement. Though still just 10, she stood straighter than most adults, her hazel eyes sweeping the crowd with a mixture of wonder and pride. In her arms she carried one of the rescued pups, now healthier, tail wagging against her coat. Bear, the German shepherd, was transformed from the battered dog that had burst into the station that night. His coat gleamed under the lanterns, thick and full. The scrape on his leg healed into a faint scar. At his full height, he radiated power and calm, his ears erect, his amber eyes scanning like a sentinel. The crowd whispered when they saw him, their voices hushed with reverence. Bear was no longer just a dog. He had become a symbol of loyalty and courage. The murmur of the crowd parted when Captain Ray Harrington stepped forward. The seasoned officer looked almost regal tonight, though his salt-and-pepper beard and broad shoulders gave him the same stoic presence he carried in every storm. His uniform was polished, the brass buttons gleaming, but it was the weight in his eyes that stilled the crowd. Years of carrying grief and grit had carved him into a man both feared and trusted, and tonight he bore the gravity of honor. Beside him stood Agent Karen Whitfield, her lean figure dressed in a black coat belted tight against the cold. Her steel-gray eyes softened slightly, unusual for her, as she glanced at Lucy and Bear. Karen had seen dozens of operations end in arrests, cages, and ledgers, but rarely did she witness a town rising together in gratitude. Her sharp features were framed by the faint silver in her cropped black hair, a reminder that she, too, carried scars of time and duty. When Harrington lifted his hand for silence, the square quieted instantly. His gravelly voice rolled out, amplified by nothing more than the authority he carried. Justice doesn't always arrive with sirens or uniforms. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a little girl in red who refused to give up, and a dog who knew the way when none of us could see. His words carried across the hush, each syllable landing with weight. Tonight we honor courage, loyalty, and the reminder that no one is too small or too voiceless to change the world. The crowd erupted in applause, boots stamping against cobblestone, gloved hands clapping until the sound echoed into the night. Harrington reached into a small case and pulled out a silver medal etched with the words, "Canine Hero." He bent one knee, fastening it to Bear's collar with careful hands. The shepherd stood tall, chest swelling, amber eyes gleaming as if he understood the honor bestowed upon him. Lucy wiped her eyes with her mitten, whispering, "Good boy," before hugging him fiercely. Then Harrington turned to Lucy. He removed his cap, an act of respect, and handed her a smaller medal hung on a red ribbon. To Lucy Hart, whose compassion lit the path through the storm. You remind us all what it means to be brave. His voice caught briefly, but he steadied it, handing the medal down. Lucy accepted it with trembling hands, cheeks flushed, eyes wet with pride. The crowd roared again, some shouting her name, others whistling, the sound filling the night with celebration. Mark stepped forward, only briefly, laying a hand on Lucy's shoulder. He didn't need medals. The look in her eyes, the sight of Bear wearing his honor, was enough. For him, the miracle had already happened, in the form of a child who had walked through a storm, guided only by faith in a dog. Around the square, families welcomed the shepherds they had chosen to adopt. One boy knelt in the snow, laughing as a once-starved dog licked his face. An older couple embraced two graying shepherds, promising them warmth for their final years. The air was alive with barking, laughter, and joy, the square filled with second chances. As lanterns flickered against the snow, Mark found himself whispering words he hadn't spoken in years. Looking at Lucy and Bear framed by light and hope, he murmured, "The Lord sent them, to save not just the dogs, but all of us." His breath hung in the air, a prayer released to the winter sky. In Silver Creek that night, people believed again, believed in miracles born from loyalty, in compassion that could heal a community, and in the truth that sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest echoes. In the frozen storm of Silver Creek, a little girl and her faithful dog accomplished what seemed impossible. They remind us that miracles are not only found in ancient scripture, but are alive in our everyday lives through compassion, courage, and faith in God. If we open our hearts, we too can become His instruments, bringing hope to others with even the smallest act of love. As Bear and Lucy proved, what feels weak can become wondrous strength when guided by the Lord. May God bless everyone watching this video, your families, your loved ones, and every living soul in need of a home. If you believe that miracles and love still exist in this world, share this story to spread hope. Don't forget to comment, subscribe to the channel, and join us in praying that God's light continues to shine in every home.